The road into the village was little more than a ribbon of dirt, flanked by gnarled trees that clawed at the sky, whispering secrets only the wind seemed to understand. It was a place the outside world had forgotten, where time moved slower, and the air itself seemed thick with unspoken warnings. In this quiet, forgotten town, families carried histories in hushed tones, their legacies buried beneath cracked paint, rotting fences, and the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. She arrived under a cloud of dread, unaware that the journey had already sealed her fate. Her mother's desperation had become a cruel transaction, a shadowy deal made with a distant cousin she had never met. No law would intervene, no authority would ask questions. The girl's life had been reduced to a ledger of debts and family obligations, a price whispered in a language of fear. The cousin's estate loomed ahead, a sprawling mansion that seemed to absorb the sunlight, its windows dark and watchful, its gates rusted but imposing. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls carried a faint echo of footsteps that might have been her own or someone else's. She sensed immediately that she had entered a world that existed outside the rules of the village, a place where the past was not just remembered but enforced. Strange rituals unfolded in muted corners, whispered orders delivered with eyes that measured and weighed every gesture. Old portraits lined the hallways, their painted faces eerily similar, suggesting secrets stitched tightly through generations. Locked doors hinted at what lay hidden, while the faint rustle of papers behind closed doors promised stories no one dared speak aloud. A servant, quiet and wary, offered her a glance heavy with warning. Escape, they seemed to say, is not a matter of effort but of luck, and luck here was in short supply. As the days stretched into weeks, she learned the patterns of her new home, who could be trusted, and who bore the weight of generations' sins. The cousin's possessiveness grew, subtle at first, then unmistakable, a tightening knot she could not loosen. Fragments of the outside world seeped in: an old newspaper, a faint broadcast on a crackling radio reminding her that freedom existed, if only as a distant echo. One night, she discovered a hidden passage, concealed behind a loose panel in the floorboards, its darkness whispering promises of escape but also threats of exposure. Every step in its shadows reminded her that danger was not only immediate, it was inevitable. And yet, the greatest terror was the silence beyond the walls. Authorities might know, might suspect, might even glimpse the horrors within, but the unspoken truth was that no one would intervene. Here, in this mansion forgotten by the world, she was alone with a legacy that refused to die, a legacy that had claimed countless lives before hers, and would not release her without a fight she was not yet prepared to wage. The village sat isolated at the edge of a winding forest, far removed from paved roads, electricity poles, or the constant hum of modern life. Even on bright days, a haze seemed to cling to the narrow lanes, as if the air itself had learned to slow down and observe the small town with cautious patience. Weathered houses leaned slightly toward one another, their timbers groaning with age, their windows reflecting more shadow than light. Children's laughter, when it arose, sounded muted and wary, echoing briefly through the alleys before fading into the heavy silence that seemed to press against every wall and gate. The villagers moved with deliberate slowness, their eyes alert to every stranger who dared approach, and their mouths careful not to speak more than necessary. Rumors and secrets were currency here. A word spoken too freely could echo across generations, and some stories were never meant to be told at all. The forest surrounding the village created a natural barrier that few ventured past. Twisted oaks and pines grew so densely that sunlight rarely touched the ground beneath them, leaving a permanent dusk of shadowed earth and tangled roots. Paths existed, worn into the soil from long years of cautious passage, but outsiders rarely found them without guidance, and even villagers hesitated to stray too far. The people had learned to read the signs of the woods. The distant snap of a branch could signal the approach of a stranger, the wind whispering through the leaves could carry more meaning than any spoken warning. There was a rhythm to life here, measured not in clocks or schedules, but in the rise and fall of the seasons, the migration of animals, and the steady vigilance of families who had lived here for generations. Among the villagers, some houses were older than memory, their histories entwined with the land itself. Stories of past tragedies and unspoken sins were stitched into the fabric of the town, passed down like folklore, yet treated as warnings rather than entertainment. Every home carried its own legacy, and those legacies intersected in ways outsiders could not fully comprehend. Visitors were rare, and when they appeared, they were observed with a kind of suspicion that bordered on hostility. Their presence felt long after they had gone. Even the local animals seemed different, watchful in a manner that suggested the land itself remembered every event, every whisper, every betrayal that had occurred within the village's borders. Life here was insular and suffocating, yet meticulously structured. People knew their neighbors' business not through gossip alone but through the quiet, unrelenting scrutiny of daily coexistence. Doors were kept closed, and yet everyone knew who passed through them, who entered late at night, and whose footsteps carried intentions better left unspoken. The village was a world apart, a place that time had seemingly abandoned, where every shadow could conceal a secret, and every glance held a story waiting to unravel. Her mother's hands trembled as she held the folded piece of paper, the ink smudged in places where tears had fallen earlier in the day. It was not a contract in the legal sense, at least not one recognized beyond the narrow boundaries of their insular world, but it carried weight heavier than any law could measure. Desperation had a way of distorting reason here, bending even the strongest moral lines until they snapped under pressure. Her mother's debts, both to people who waited patiently and to those who waited silently, had grown too large to ignore. Threats, whispered promises of retribution, and the weight of family expectation all pressed upon her like a physical force. And so, in the dim glow of a flickering lantern, the decision was made. The girl would be sent to a cousin several towns away, a man whose name she had heard only in hushed tones, whose face she had never seen. The girl herself was too young to understand the full implications of the arrangement, but she felt the tension vibrating in the air, sharp and tangible. There was a sense that she was no longer fully her own, that her life had been measured, weighed, and traded like a commodity, and she could not the outcome. Her mother, her words clipped and uneven, each syllable laden with the weight of shame and fear. There were no protests, no attempts to soften the blow, only the quiet acknowledgement that this path had been chosen, that it would be followed to its inevitable conclusion. Even the neighbors who noticed the preparations said nothing. In a place where the past cast long shadows, and family honor was measured in obedience and silence, no one dared intervene. The arrangements themselves were carried out in secrecy. Money exchanged hands, though in amounts trivial to the outside world, significant only in their symbolic confirmation of the transaction. Gifts, clothing, and provisions were gathered hastily, enough to sustain the girl on her journey but not so much as to suggest comfort. The cousin's home was described in vague terms, a distant estate hidden among the hills, its details obscured deliberately, perhaps to soften the edges of reality, perhaps to make escape seem impossible before she even arrived. On the day she was to leave, the atmosphere in the home was thick with unspoken fear. Her mother's eyes, rimmed with red, avoided direct contact, and her father, though silent, exuded a tension that spoke louder than any words could. The girl's own heart raced, pounding with a mixture of confusion, apprehension, and an instinctive sense that her world was about to shift in ways that could never be undone. She would soon discover that the cousin she was sent to was not merely a distant relative, but a gatekeeper to a lineage steeped in secrets, where every interaction carried consequence, and every misstep could reverberate across generations. The carriage slowed as it creaked over uneven stones, each wheel groaning under the weight of her apprehension. Through the misted windows, she glimpsed the cousin's estate for the first time, a sprawling structure that seemed from the land itself, dark and jagged against the waning light. Its stone walls were mottled with moss, as if nature had claimed portions of it over decades of neglect, yet the windows gleamed with a careful polish that betrayed the presence of watchful eyes within. The gates, wrought iron and towering, opened silently with an almost ritualistic precision, admitting her into a world that was both familiar and alien, a place where family ties carried meanings she had yet to comprehend. Inside, the air was heavier, warmer than the cool evening outside, but thick with a scent she could not name: old wood, smoke, something faintly metallic that pricked her senses. Shadows stretched across the long hallways, cast by candlelight flickering in wall sconces. Every step she took echoed too loudly, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that she was being observed, measured, judged. Portraits of men and women lined the walls, their eyes unsettlingly lifelike, following her movements as if recognizing her presence, her blood, the invisible strings that tied her to this house before she even crossed its threshold. The cousin himself appeared at the end of the hall, tall and rigid, his expression unreadable. He offered a formal nod, not a welcome, and gestured to the rooms that would serve as her temporary and soon permanent residence. There were no comforting words, no attempt to soften the reality of her new life. She noticed the subtle tension in the air, the way the servants moved with quiet precision, their eyes darting to her and then away, as if acknowledging her intrusion but careful not to draw attention to it. As she was shown to her room, the doors themselves seemed oppressive, heavy with locks and bolts, the key left conspicuously within reach, yet more a reminder than a promise of freedom. From the small window, she could see the grounds sprawling endlessly, but every path seemed overgrown, tangled, and inaccessible, as though the estate itself was designed to keep her contained. The walls carried echoes of past conversations, laughter, and arguments, remnants of lives intertwined over generations, and she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her. By the end of the evening, she realized the full extent of her isolation. The estate was more than a home, it was a maze, a carefully constructed world where every glance, every whispered instruction, and every shadowed corner served to remind her that she had entered a place governed not by choice but by legacy. It was a world she had no way of leaving, and a life whose rules she would have to learn quickly or suffer the consequences. It did not take long for her to sense the invisible walls that enclosed her, far beyond the physical doors and locks that defined her room. The cousin's authority was quiet but absolute, a presence that filled every hallway, every shadowed corner of the estate. Rules were unspoken at first, but quickly became apparent in subtle ways: how she moved through the corridors, when she spoke, where she could sit or linger. Even small gestures, a glance too long, a question asked too freely, were met with a sharpness of gaze that made her retreat, trembling with the realization that any misstep would not go unnoticed. The servants, carefully trained and equally watchful, mirrored this control. Their movements were deliberate, their eyes flicking to her and back to their tasks with a precision that made it clear they were measuring her reactions, gauging her understanding of the unspoken hierarchy. She noticed how they whispered to one another when she passed, quickly silencing themselves when their eyes met hers, leaving her with the sense that her presence had already disrupted a fragile balance maintained for generations. The cousin rarely raised his voice, yet the tension in the air was enough to make her heart pound. Authority did not need volume here. It lived in the stillness, in the sudden silence when she entered a room, in the way shadows seemed to gather around her as if confirming her place within a system she could not yet name. She began to notice the rituals embedded in the household. Mealtimes were structured, almost ceremonial, with seats assigned not randomly but according to some pattern she could not yet decipher. Tasks were distributed carefully, each chore performed with precision and adherence to rules she could barely comprehend. Even leisure was monitored. When she attempted to wander through the gardens, she found herself quickly intercepted, redirected with a casual firmness that left no room for argument. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her more closely with each passing day, and she began to understand that the estate itself was a living, breathing enforcer of control. Locked doors were more than physical barriers, they were symbols of the limits placed upon her. Hallways that twisted back upon themselves, staircases leading to rooms she was never allowed to enter, even the arrangement of furniture, all of it conveyed a message. She was not free, she was observed, and her movements, choices, and very thoughts were subject to scrutiny. Even the smallest lapse, the slightest hesitation, could draw immediate attention, and she felt the weight of her new reality settling over her, heavy and inescapable. This was no ordinary home, it was a carefully maintained world where obedience was enforced not with violence but with subtler, more insidious methods. Here, control was not a threat but a presence, omnipresent and inevitable, shaping her every action and thought long before she realized that the estate's rules extended far beyond its walls, into the very core of her being. It was in the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the estate seemed to settle into its mechanical rhythms, that she began to notice the small anomalies, hints of a past hidden beneath layers of discipline and silence. A door left slightly ajar, a narrow staircase curling into darkness, a key that seemed too ornate to belong to any ordinary lock, all of these whispered promises of secrets that were never meant for her eyes. Curiosity, once a fleeting instinct, now became a dangerous companion, pulling her toward corners of the estate that had been meticulously obscured by those who lived there for generations. In an abandoned study at the far end of the West Wing, she found a stack of journals bound in cracked leather. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting, though neat, trembled at times as if recording thoughts that had haunted the writer for decades. She read about family members whose lives were intertwined in ways that defied conventional understanding, marriages arranged not for love but for preservation of bloodlines, and the unspoken consequences of defiance. Every entry carried a weight that made her stomach churn, a confirmation that the estate's pristine facade masked patterns of obsession, control, and manipulation repeated over generations. Photographs hidden behind frames revealed faces that were startlingly similar, each generation echoing the features of the last, eyes that seemed to hold the same mixture of fear, cunning, and resignation. She traced her fingers over the images, feeling a shiver run through her as recognition struck. These were not just ancestors but living echoes of the very system that had claimed her. Letters, yellowed and brittle, contained instructions, threats, and warnings, addressed to those who had tried to resist the family's grip, their tone formal yet unmistakably cold, as though the estate itself spoke through the ink. Even the furniture, the rooms, the placement of objects, all seemed coded, as if every detail were a message meant for those trained to read it. She began to understand that the estate was a repository of memory and control, a physical manifestation of secrets so carefully guarded that no outsider, and often no insider, could ever fully comprehend them. The more she discovered, the more aware she became of the line she was treading, a line that could not be crossed without consequences. The knowledge brought both dread and a grim clarity. She was not simply a guest, not merely a victim of circumstance. She had stepped into a world that had been curated to control, isolate, and perpetuate itself, where every revelation came with the unspoken warning that curiosity could be as dangerous as defiance. And in the silence of the estate, as shadows stretched across the walls and the candle flames flickered with uneasy light, she realized that some truths were meant to remain hidden, yet the human mind resists confinement, always seeking what it is told it cannot see. It was during one of the rare moments when the estate seemed almost still that she received her first real warning. A servant, one of the few who showed any semblance of kindness, appeared at the edge of her path, eyes darting nervously toward the hallways as if shadows themselves might overhear their words. His voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that she could not ignore. He spoke of things she had only begun to suspect, of family rules that stretched beyond doors and locks, of consequences for those who questioned or attempted to defy them, and of the unspoken hierarchy that dictated every life within the estate. The words fell slowly, deliberately, into her mind, leaving impressions she could not shake. He did not speak of the cousin directly, nor did he accuse him of overt cruelty. Instead, he painted a picture of inevitability, a system in which rebellion was met with subtle but absolute retribution. He described doors that should never be opened, hallways that led to forgotten corners, and a past filled with whispers of those who had tried and failed to escape the family's grip. Every warning carried an undertone of fear, not just for her physical safety, but for the psychological weight of existing under constant scrutiny, where every action could ripple through generations. She listened, heart pounding, as he hinted at the ways the estate maintained control, the servants who were both allies and informants, the cousin whose calm demeanor masked a calculating intelligence, and the legacy of obedience ingrained over decades. He spoke of patterns repeated so meticulously that the family seemed almost like a living organism, enforcing its own rules and punishing deviations in ways that outsiders could neither perceive nor understand. Each anecdote he shared was a cautionary tale, stories of those who had vanished quietly, their disappearances attributed to misfortune or accidents, yet the truth remained unspoken, concealed behind polite smiles and the estate's oppressive walls. The warning carried another, deeper layer. It was not only about survival but about vigilance, about understanding that knowledge itself could be dangerous. Curiosity might bring insight, but it also drew attention, and attention here was never innocent. The servant's eyes, flicking toward the shadows as if they themselves could carry threats, told her that even this brief moment of counsel could be risky, that being caught listening or asking too much could seal her fate before she had even begun to grasp the rules. By the time he left, the girl was left trembling with a mix of gratitude and fear. The warning had crystallized a harsh truth. The estate was not merely a home or a prison, it was a carefully constructed world where control was maintained not through obvious force but through a network of observation, expectation, and quiet intimidation. And in that realization, she understood the precariousness of her existence, and that any misstep could lead to consequences far more chilling than she had yet imagined. Days and nights blurred together in the estate, each one folding into the next with the same suffocating rhythm. She moved through the halls with caution, careful to follow every rule, to avoid the piercing gaze of the cousin, and to remain invisible to the servants who observed her every step. Yet, no matter how obedient she appeared, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if the estate itself were aware of her presence and disapproved of it. The isolation became heavier with every passing hour, pressing against her chest until breathing felt like a conscious effort, each inhale reminding her of how small and powerless she had become. The cousin's control intensified in ways she could not fully name. At first, it was subtle, a lingering look, a raised eyebrow, a correction whispered under the breath. But over time, it became unmistakable, a tightening coil of authority that left her little room to think or act freely. Every decision she made, no matter how insignificant, was scrutinized, judged, catalogued, and used as a reminder of her dependence. Even the simplest desires, wandering the garden, speaking freely to a servant, holding a book longer than permitted, were met with consequences so carefully orchestrated that they left no question about her position in this household. Loneliness seeped into her bones, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. She longed for contact, for compassion, for even the faintest hint of kindness that did not carry a hidden agenda. Yet each attempt to reach out was met with resistance, subtle enough to confuse her at first, then increasingly deliberate. Trust became a dangerous currency, and every encounter reminded her that alliances were fleeting, that people in this world existed within a lattice of obligation and fear. There were moments when her stomach twisted with the realization that she was utterly alone, her voice unheard, her presence acknowledged only as part of the estate's machinery of control. Her thoughts grew restless, racing through endless scenarios of escape and confrontation, each one more desperate than the last. The hidden journals she had glimpsed, the forbidden rooms she had glimpsed, the whispered warnings of the servant, all of it became both a lifeline and a source of torment. She began to feel the raw edge of fear, not just of physical punishment, but of the psychological weight of living in a place where every choice could be twisted against her. Each day that passed without relief, without intervention, deepened her despair. The house, the cousin, the servants, even the portraits on the walls, seemed complicit in her growing hopelessness. The desperation was not a single moment of panic but a slow, grinding pressure, a realization that she was trapped in a world meticulously designed to contain, monitor, and control her, and that any glimmer of hope might be snuffed out before she could accede. It was a rare morning when the air beyond her window seemed different, as though the estate's heavy shadows had briefly lifted to reveal a glimpse of life beyond its walls. She pressed her hands against the cold glass and stared out the distant hills where sunlight broke through the mist and illuminated patches of green that felt impossibly free. The estate, with all its rules, its walls, and its suffocating traditions, had insulated her from the wider world for so long that even the faintest hint of it sparked a mixture of awe and longing. In that fragile light, she remembered stories she had overheard as a child, tales of towns with bustling markets, laughter carried through open streets, and strangers who passed without fear or suspicion. Small remnants of the outside crept into her life in unexpected ways, each one igniting both hope and anxiety. A stray newspaper left by a careless servant revealed headlines about events and people far from the estate, a world in which her life was not predetermined by bloodlines and secrecy. She read about fairs, marriages, tragedies, and triumphs in towns she had never seen, each story a reminder that the life she had been forced into was not universal, that normalcy existed beyond the iron gates and locked doors of her prison. The pages crinkled under her fingers, carrying more than words, they carried possibility, a sense that escape was conceivable even if perilous. A radio, old and crackling with static, occasionally emitted fragments of voices and music from towns far beyond the hills. The sound was distorted, but the laughter and arguments, the music and announcements, were enough to make her heart ache. It was a world alive and breathing, moving forward even as she remained trapped, each broadcast a cruel reminder that life continued elsewhere, unbound by the cruel hierarchy she had been thrust into. Even glimpses of travelers passing along distant roads, visible from a high window, sparked a sharp ache of longing. Carriages, pedestrians, even children playing in the sunlight, they existed outside the estate's oppressive watchfulness, their freedoms apparent in every movement. In these moments, her desperation deepened, fueled by the contrast between the cage she occupied and the world beyond, a world that might never notice her absence, yet existed as proof that life could be different, vibrant, and unconstrained. Each fragment of the outside world became both a temptation and a torment. The estate's shadows seemed darker in comparison, the cousin's control heavier, the walls more suffocating. Yet in that juxtaposition, she began to understand something vital. The estate could contain her body, her daily movements, her routine, but it could not fully cage her mind. And in that sliver of awareness, she recognized the spark of defiance, the fragile seed of hope that would, if nurtured carefully, guide her toward freedom she had only begun to imagine. It was late one evening, when the estate had settled into the quiet rhythm of candlelight and the distant hum of the wind through the eaves, that she stumbled upon it. A panel, slightly misaligned, tucked away behind a tall, dusty bookshelf in the corner of the study she had begun to haunt out of both curiosity and desperation. At first, she thought it a trick of the dim light, a shadow that played upon her eyes. But as she pressed her fingers against the worn wood, she felt the faint give of hinges, subtle but deliberate, as though the house itself had been waiting for someone to notice. The passage beyond was narrow, dark, and musty, smelling of old stone, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that pricked her senses. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs, torn between the instinct to retreat and the overpowering curiosity that had driven her to explore so many forbidden corners. Her fingers traced the edge of the entrance, and she discovered a thin rope tied to a small hook, likely left as a guide or warning. Every instinct screamed at her that she was stepping into danger, yet the thought of freedom, of glimpsing a path beyond the walls, overpowered her fear. The corridor twisted and turned, narrow enough that she had to keep her arms close, brushing against the stone walls that seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets long hidden. Faint draughts of air whispered through cracks above her, carrying the faintest hint of the outside world: smoke, leaves, a smell of rain-soaked earth. It was intoxicating, a promise that there was life beyond the estate's oppressive boundaries, and with each step she felt a spark of hope she had not dared to feel in weeks. The passage was not without its warnings. Loose stones threatened to betray her presence with the slightest misstep, and echoes traveled far, a single whisper magnified into a chorus of suspicion. Every creak reminded her that discovery could be instantaneous and unforgiving. She realized that while this route might offer escape, it also represented the very real possibility of exposure, of being caught not just by the cousin, but by the meticulous network of observation that maintained control over the household. As she pressed forward, the weight of generations of secrets pressed down upon her. She understood, with a chilling clarity, that those who had lived in this house before her had relied on these hidden passages to protect themselves, to evade scrutiny, or perhaps to disappear entirely. The passage was both a lifeline and a gauntlet, a narrow bridge between captivity and freedom, opportunity and danger. And in the oppressive stillness, lit only by the faint glow of her lantern, she realized that this discovery might be her only chance at reclaiming her life, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Even as she explored the hidden passage and glimpsed the faint promise of freedom, there remained a weight far heavier than any lock or door, the awareness that she was being watched, always, by forces she could not name. The cousin's presence extended beyond the visible, infiltrating the hallways, the rooms, even the shadows that clung to corners. But it was not only him. There was the sense, persistent and gnawing, that the estate itself was alive with eyes she could not see, minds she could not understand, and loyalties she could not predict. The servants, the portraits, the creaking floorboards all seemed complicit, or at least trained to observe, reporting every nuance of her movement, her hesitation, her curiosity. The threat was not overt, it did not announce itself with malice. Instead, it existed in glances, in the calculated silence, in the way the air seemed to tighten around her when she lingered too long in certain spaces. She began to understand that the unseen threat extended beyond the walls of the estate itself. Rumors of authorities who might have known, who might have suspected, or who might have caught glimpses of irregularities in the family's history hovered at the edge of her mind. The stories suggested that investigation was possible, yet impossible, as if the world beyond the gates had consciously chosen not to intervene. Every reflection of this reality deepened her unease. She was isolated not only by geography and family but by a larger, invisible web of complicity and indifference. The knowledge made her movements tentative, her steps measured, and her thoughts constantly alert. In the dead of night, she would lie awake, listening to the faint creaks of the house, imagining shadowy figures moving beyond her line of sight. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers, fragmented conversations carried on currents of air, teasing her with possibilities of betrayal and deception. The idea that danger could strike without warning, without immediate explanation, made every plan for escape precarious, every strategy vulnerable to the unseen network she could neither identify nor confront. Even the walls seemed to hold memory, a silent archive of those who had tried and failed, warning her that any act of defiance could reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The unseen threat was suffocating precisely because it was intangible. It was not a single person or act but a pervasive force, a combination of vigilance, fear, history, and secrecy, all intertwined to create a world where freedom was not merely difficult, it was nearly impossible. She realized that survival would require more than courage, it would demand patience, cunning, and the ability to navigate a labyrinth of shadows and silence. And in that quiet, oppressive knowledge, she understood the full scope of her peril, that even in the act of thinking about escape, she might already be ensnared by eyes, minds, and forces that refused to let her go.